I grabbed the radio with shaking hands, my thumb hovering over the talk button. The screams were getting worse, raw, desperate sounds that made my skin crawl. Someone was dying out there, and I was sitting in this cabin like a coward. "Maurice, there's someone in serious trouble," I said into the radio. "I'm going out there." Static crackled for a few seconds before his voice came through, calm as if he was discussing the weather. "Eddie, stay inside. Follow the rules." "Are you kidding me?" The screams rose to an impossible pitch, echoing off the mountains. "Someone's being murdered out there. Rule number 11, Eddie. Stay inside after sunset when you hear human screams." I stared at the radio like it had just told me the earth was flat. "Maurice, I'm not going to sit here while someone gets killed. That's not who I am. It's who you need to be if you want to survive your first week." The screams cut off abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like the forest was holding its breath. I waited, listening for any sound. A whimper, a call for help, anything that would justify grabbing my flashlight and running toward whatever nightmare was happening out there. Nothing. I keyed the radio again. "Maurice, they stopped. We need to get out there and—" "No, we don't. Go to bed, Eddie. We'll talk in the morning." The radio went dead. I tried calling back 3 times, but got nothing except static. I sat at the small kitchen table, staring at that stupid laminated list. Rule 11, asterisk, ignore human screams after sunset. Do not investigate. Do not go outside. The words looked even more insane now that I'd heard what they were talking about. What kind of place had I moved to where ignoring people in distress was official policy? My phone had no signal, hadn't since I'd driven up the mountain road to the cabin. The landline worked, but who was I going to call? 911? "Hi, I'm hearing screams in Yellowstone and my supervisor told me to ignore them. They'd think I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was. I'd left a 6-figure job in San Francisco for this. My parents had been horrified when I told them I was becoming a forest ranger. "You're throwing your life away," my mom had said. "All that education, all that success, for what? To live in the woods like a hermit?" Right now, sitting in this cabin while people screamed in the darkness, I was starting to think she had a point. The screams started again around 1 a.m. This time they were closer, maybe 100 yards from the cabin. I could hear the individual voices now. At least 3 people, maybe more. A woman sobbing, a man shouting for help. Someone younger, could have been a teenager, making sounds I never want to hear again. I stood up so fast my chair fell over. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to grab my gear and run toward those voices. These were people in trouble, real people who needed help. But Maurice's voice kept echoing in my head. Asterisk. Follow the rules. I paced the cabin's main room, which took about 6 steps in any direction. The screaming went on and on, sometimes fading like the people were being dragged away, then getting louder again. I pressed my hands against my ears, but I could still hear them. At 1:47 a.m., according to the digital clock on the microwave, the screams stopped again. The silence was somehow worse than the noise. I found myself straining to hear something, anything that would tell me what had happened out there. But the forest had gone completely quiet. No wind in the trees, no night birds, no insects, nothing. I looked at the rules again, focusing on number 11. Someone had written this down. Someone had decided that ignoring human screams was important enough to put on an official list. Maurice had handed me this list with a straight face, like it was perfectly normal. What the hell was wrong with this place? I tried to think logically about it. Maybe there were animals that could mimic human voices. I'd seen nature documentaries about birds that could copy sounds. Maybe there were predators here that used human screams to lure people out of safe areas. That would explain the rule, right? Don't fall for the trick. But those screams had sounded so real, so human, so full of genuine terror and pain. I made coffee even though I knew I wouldn't sleep anyway. While it brewed, I went through the other rules again, looking for clues about what I'd gotten myself into. Asterisk Rule 7, never follow unmarked trails, especially with strangers. Asterisk Rule 12, if you feel like you're being watched, don't turn around. Back away slowly while facing the same direction. Asterisk Rule 16, if the landline rings after 10 p.m., don't answer it. Asterisk Rule 19, always carry cookies or small snacks. You never know when you'll have unexpected visitors. Each rule sounded crazier than the last, but after tonight, I wasn't so quick to dismiss them. Someone had learned these things the hard way. Someone had figured out that you needed rules to survive in this place. I thought about Maurice's face when he'd mentioned his former partner, Shelby Thompson, transferred after an incident. The way he'd said it, like he was reciting a story he'd told before, like he was hiding something. What if she hadn't been transferred? What if something had happened to her out here? Something that couldn't be explained in an official report. The coffee tasted like dirt, but it was hot and gave me something to do with my hands. I sat back down at the table and really looked at the rules for the first time, not dismissing them as hazing or folklore, but trying to understand what they were actually telling me. These weren't pranks, they were survival instructions. Someone had written down everything you needed to know to stay alive in this job, and they'd done it in the most straightforward way possible. No explanations, no context, just the essential information. Do this, don't do that, carry cookies. The screams started a third time at 2:23 a.m. This time I was ready for them. I sat at the table with my coffee and the rule list, forcing myself to listen without reacting. The voices were different now, older, younger, some speaking words I couldn't quite make out. They seemed to be moving in a pattern around the cabin, sometimes close enough that I could hear individual sobs, sometimes fading into the distance. I noticed something else this time. They moved in a circle, like whatever was making them was walking a perimeter around the cabin, testing the boundaries, seeing if I would break, but I didn't break. I sat there and listened and followed rule number 11, even though every fiber of my being wanted to run outside and help. The screams stopped at 3:15 a.m. and didn't start again. I stayed awake until sunrise, watching the windows and jumping at every small sound. When the first light started filtering through the trees, I felt like I'd survived something, though I wasn't sure what. My radio crackled to life at 6 a.m. sharp. "Eddie, you there?" Maurice's voice sounded normal, like nothing had happened. "I'm here." "Good. How was your first night?" I looked at the rule list, still spread out on the table in front of me. "Educational." "That's what I like to hear. Coffee's on at the station when you're ready. We've got work to do." I gathered my gear slowly, checking the windows one more time before opening the door. The forest looked completely normal in the morning light, green and peaceful and beautiful. Birds were singing. A squirrel ran across the clearing in front of the cabin. No sign that anything unusual had happened here a few hours ago. But as I walked to my truck, I noticed something that made me stop cold. The ground around the cabin was covered in footprints, dozens of them, maybe more, forming a perfect circle about 20 feet from the building. Human footprints, all different sizes, like a crowd of people had been walking around and around the cabin all night. I followed the circle with my eyes, counting the different prints. Men's boots, women's shoes, what looked like children's sneakers, all of them facing inward, toward the cabin. Toward me. I got in my truck and drove to the ranger station without looking back. Maurice was waiting with coffee and a knowing expression that told me he'd been through this before, probably many times. "So," he said, handing me a steaming mug. "Any questions about the rules?" I thought about the screams, the footprints, the long night of terror and confusion. I thought about my old job in San Francisco, where the biggest danger was carpal tunnel syndrome, and the worst mystery was why the office coffee always tasted burnt. "Just one," I said. "How many people actually make it through their first week?" Maurice smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The ones who follow the rules." I shouldered my pack and headed out on the North Trail, still muttering about the stupidity of leaving peanut butter sandwiches in the woods. Maurice had handed me 6 of them that morning, wrapped in wax paper like some kind of forest care package. "Trail maintenance," he'd said with that same straight face he used for everything. "Bears get cranky when they're hungry." Right, because feeding bears was definitely standard Park Service protocol. The morning was actually pretty nice though. Cool air, birds doing their thing, sunlight filtering through the trees in that way that makes you understand why people write poetry about nature. I'd been walking for maybe an hour, dropping sandwiches at the spots Maurice had marked on my map, when I heard someone coming up the trail behind me. Beautiful morning, isn't it? I turned around to see a woman about my age, Asian, with one of those expensive hiking setups that screamed weekend warrior from the city. She had perfect posture and a smile that belonged in a toothpaste commercial. "Yeah, it really is," I said. "You're out early. I love getting an early start. I'm Rosie Chang." She adjusted her pristine backpack straps. "I'm camping at the Pine Creek site for a few days. You must be the new ranger everyone's talking about." Eddie Wong. And I didn't know anyone was talking about me. "Oh, small community up here. Word travels fast." Her smile never wavered. I've been coming to this area for years. The wildlife is incredible if you know where to look. We started walking together, which felt natural enough. Rosie knew her stuff. She pointed out bird calls I couldn't identify and explained the difference between black bear and grizzly tracks when we found some prints in the mud. She had this encyclopedic knowledge of local flora that made me feel like the amateur I was. "There's a family of river otters about 2 miles up," she said. "They're usually active this time of morning, and if you're really lucky, you might spot the golden eagles that nest on the north face. You really know this place. Like I said, I've been coming here for years. There are so many hidden spots that most people never see." She gestured toward a gap in the trees that I hadn't even noticed. "There's this amazing waterfall about a 1/4 mile that way. Completely untouched, no crowds, just pure wilderness." I looked where she was pointing. No trail markers, no official path, just trees and undergrowth. "Sounds beautiful, but I should probably stick to the marked trails." "Oh, it's perfectly safe. I've been there dozens of times. The path is well worn, just not officially maintained." Rosie's enthusiasm was infectious. "It would only take 20 minutes, and the view is absolutely worth it. I could show you the way." Something in my brain started waving a tiny red flag. Rule number 7 floated up from memory. Asterisk, never follow unmarked trails, especially with strangers. "Thanks, but I've got a job to finish here," I said. "Maybe another time." "Are you sure? It's really spectacular. The water comes down about 60 feet into this perfect pool. You can see all the way to the bottom." She was still smiling that perfect smile. "I'd hate for you to miss it." The red flag got bigger. There was something about the way she was pushing this, like she really needed me to come with her. And now that I was paying attention, something else was bothering me too. Her smile hadn't changed once since we'd started talking. Not a twitch, not a shift, just that same exact expression. "I appreciate the offer, but I really need to stick to my route." A hawk called somewhere overhead, one of those sharp cries that echoes off the mountains. Rosie tilted her head like she was listening, and then she spoke again. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" But it wasn't her voice anymore. It was mine. Exactly mine, down to the inflection and tone, like someone had played back a recording of me speaking. I felt ice water dump into my stomach. "What did you just say?" "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" she repeated, still in my voice, still wearing that unchanging smile. Her eyes hadn't blinked once since the hawk called. Not once. Rule 12 crashed into my consciousness. Asterisk. If you feel like you're being watched, don't turn around. Back away slowly while facing the same direction. I started backing up the trail, keeping my eyes on Rosie. She didn't move, just stood there with my voice coming out of her mouth. "You must be the new ranger everyone's talking about," she said. But now it was my voice saying words I'd never spoken. "I've got a job to finish here, maybe another time." Each step backward felt like it took forever. Rosie stayed perfectly still, but her head tracked my movement with mechanical precision. No natural sway, no unconscious shifts in posture, just that locked-on stare, and my own words echoing back at me. "The wildlife is incredible if you know where to look," she said in my voice. "It would only take 20 minutes. I kept backing away, fighting every instinct that told me to turn and run. The trail curved behind me, and I had to trust my feet to find solid ground while keeping my eyes on whatever Rosie actually was. "Perfectly safe," she repeated. Dozens of times. Absolutely worth it. When I finally reached the curve in the trail, I risked a quick glance over my shoulder to make sure I wasn't about to back into a tree. When I looked forward again, Rosie was gone. I stood there for a full minute, scanning the trees and listening for any sound of movement. Nothing. It was like she'd never been there at all, except for the echo of my own voice still ringing in my ears. I walked back to my truck faster than I'd ever walked anywhere in my life. Maurice was waiting at the ranger station with 2 cups of coffee, like he'd known exactly when I'd be back. He took one look at my face and nodded. "Let me guess. Friendly hiker, knew a lot about local wildlife, wanted to show you something off the beaten path." I sat down hard in the chair across from his desk. "She was copying my voice, Maurice, perfectly. How is that possible? Same way the screams are possible. Same way a lot of things are possible up here." He pushed one of the coffee cups toward me. "What did she look like?" "Asian woman, maybe 25. Expensive gear, said her name was Rosie Chang." Maurice wrote something in a notebook. "She offered to take you anywhere specific?" "A waterfall, 1/4 mile off the north trail." I wrapped my hands around the coffee cup, trying to stop them from shaking. She really wanted me to go with her. I bet she did. Maurice closed the notebook. You did good, Eddie. Following the rules probably saved your life. What was she? We call them copycats. They're good at mimicking human behavior, but they can't quite get it right. Always something a little off if you know what to look for. The smile, I said. It never changed, and she didn't blink. That's them. They're fascinated by human voices, collect them like trophies. The ones who go off trail with them usually don't come back. I thought about Rosie's perfect knowledge of the area, her enthusiasm about the hidden waterfall. How many people have they gotten? More than I like to think about. Maurice leaned back in his chair. That's why we have the rules, Eddie. Every single one of them was written in someone's blood. Your former partner, I said. Kathy Park. Is that what happened to her? Maurice was quiet for a long moment. Kathy stopped following the rules, started thinking she knew better, that she could handle whatever was out there. Department transferred her to a desk job in Denver after she had what they classified as a mental breakdown. But it wasn't really a breakdown. No, it wasn't. He met my eyes. She saw things that don't officially exist, Eddie. Things the Park Service can't acknowledge without causing mass panic. So they moved her somewhere safe and put it in her file as stress-related psychological issues. I stared into my coffee, trying to process what he was telling me. How long has this been going on? Long as there have been people in these mountains. Maybe longer. Maurice stood up and walked to the window. The rules aren't hazing, Eddie. They're survival instructions for a job that doesn't officially exist. What job? Keeping people safe from things they can't understand. Making sure the wrong people don't wander into the wrong places. Protecting secrets that need to stay secret. I thought about the screams, the footprints around my cabin, Rosie's unchanging smile, and if I can't handle it, then you'll get transferred to Denver too, and we'll tell the next guy that you had a breakdown. Maurice turned back to me, but I don't think that's going to happen. You followed the rules when it mattered. That's more than a lot of people can do. Outside the window, the forest looked peaceful and normal. Just trees and mountains and blue sky. But I knew now that was only part of the picture. There was another layer underneath, something that required rules like carrying cookies and ignoring human screams. So what happens now? Now you learn the rest of it, Maurice said, and you decide if you're staying or going. I finished my coffee and looked at the man who'd been protecting people from impossible things for longer than I wanted to think about. I'm staying. Good. He smiled, and this time it reached his eyes, because we've got a lot more work to do. I was checking fence posts along the Meadow Creek Trail when I saw it, a massive deer standing upright on its hind legs like a person, staring directly at me from maybe 50 yards away. My first instinct was to stare back because what the hell was I looking at? But rule number 4 kicked in before I could make that mistake. Asterisk. If you encounter wildlife behaving unusually, do not make eye contact. Keep your head down and continue your normal activities. I forced my eyes to the ground and kept walking, focusing on the worn path under my boots. The fence post I'd been heading toward suddenly seemed a million miles away. Every step felt deliberate and wrong, like I was ignoring a predator that could decide to charge at any second. But I could feel it watching me, that prickly sensation between your shoulder blades when someone's staring, except amplified about 1,000 times. The deer, if that's what it actually was, tracked my movement for over a mile. I knew because every time I risked a quick glance at the trail ahead, I caught a glimpse of brown fur in my peripheral vision, always maintaining that same distance. When I finally reached my truck, I was drenched in sweat despite the cool mountain air. I didn't look back as I drove away, but I checked my rearview mirror obsessively until the trees blocked my view of the trail. That evening, I spread incident reports across my kitchen table, trying to make sense of the patterns Maurice had hinted at. 5 years of missing person cases, and the more I read, the more my stomach twisted into knots. Sarah Martinez, 28, last seen heading toward what she described as a beautiful trail with wild flowers that park rangers couldn't locate. David Chen, 35, told his camping partner he was following an old mining road that didn't appear on any official maps. Jennifer Walsh, 22, left a note saying she'd found the most amazing hidden path before disappearing completely. The reports all had the same thread: people following trails that shouldn't exist, drawn to places that weren't supposed to be there, and every single case remained unsolved, filed away with the kind of bureaucratic language that meant nobody wanted to dig deeper. I was cross-referencing locations when the landline rang at 10:07 p.m. I stared at the phone, remembering Rule 16, asterisk. If the landline rings after 10 p.m., don't answer it. but curiosity won out over caution. I picked up on the fourth ring. "Hello." Static filled the line, punctuated by a voice that sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Help, please. I'm lost." "Where are you?" I asked, grabbing a pen. "What's your location?" The silver trail, past the crying rocks." The voice faded in and out. "Can't find. Been walking for days. There's no silver trail on the park maps. Can you give me landmarks? Something I can—" The line went dead. I sat there, holding the phone, trying to make sense of what I'd heard. The voice had sounded genuinely desperate, but the location made no sense. Crying rocks? I'd memorized every trail map, every geological feature in this section of the park. The phone rang again at 10:23 p.m. This time I hesitated, my hand hovering over the receiver. Rule 16 existed for a reason, but what if someone really needed help? "Hello? Please, the bone bridge is collapsing." A different voice, older, crackling through heavy static. "Tell my family. Tell them I tried to come home." "Sir, what's your name? Where exactly are you?" "Past the Mirror Lake, where the trees grow backwards." The voice was fading. Don't let them take the children." The line went dead again. My hands were shaking as I stared at the phone. Mirror Lake, trees growing backwards. None of this matched any real geography. But the desperation in those voices had sounded completely genuine. When the phone rang a third time at 10:41 p.m., I didn't hesitate. I yanked the cord from the wall. The silence that followed felt heavier than the static. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by missing person reports and the echo of impossible pleas for help. Every rational part of my brain said those calls were fake, some kind of supernatural trick designed to lure me into making stupid decisions. But they'd sounded so real. Around midnight, something started scratching on the roof. Light scratching at first, like a raccoon or squirrel had gotten up there. Then heavier, more deliberate. Something with claws was walking back and forth above my head, and whatever it was had serious weight to it. The ceiling creaked with each step. I grabbed the package of chocolate chip cookies from my counter. Rule 19 had become second nature after 3 weeks of this job. Asterisk, always carry cookies or small snacks. You never know when you'll have unexpected visitors. The scratching stopped. For about 30 seconds, everything was quiet. Then something dropped from the roof to the ground outside with a thud that shook the cabin windows. I moved to the kitchen window and peered through the curtains. A dog sat in the clearing outside my cabin, except calling it a dog was like calling a grizzly bear a house cat. This thing was the size of a small horse, with black fur so dark it seemed to absorb the moonlight. Its eyes glowed with an eerie blue light that definitely wasn't natural. It sat perfectly still, watching the cabin, watching me. My mouth went dry as I remembered Maurice's words about unexpected visitors. This had to be what Rule 19 was talking about. But offering cookies to a supernatural wolf thing seemed like the kind of decision that ended with me becoming a missing person report. The creature tilted its massive head, still staring directly at the window, still waiting. I looked down at the cookies in my hand, then back at those glowing blue eyes. Every survival instinct I had screamed at me to stay inside, lock the door, and hope it went away. But Maurice's rules hadn't steered me wrong yet. I walked to the front door and opened it slowly. The giant dog didn't move, just watched me with that unsettling intelligence. Up close, I could see that its proportions were slightly wrong. Too large, too muscular, with teeth that caught the moonlight when it panted. "Hey there," I said quietly, holding out a handful of cookies. "These what you're looking for?" The creature stood and approached with careful, measured steps. It took the cookies from my palm with surprising gentleness, its massive jaws barely brushing my skin. For a moment, we just looked at each other, me terrified but trying not to show it, the dog studying me with those impossible blue eyes. Then it turned and vanished into the forest without a sound, leaving me standing in my doorway with an empty cookie package and the absolute certainty that I'd just fed something that had never been a normal dog. I closed the door and leaned against it, my heart hammering against my ribs. 3 weeks ago, I'd been debugging software and complaining about traffic. Now I was hand-feeding supernatural creatures in the middle of the night, and somehow still breathing. The missing person reports were still scattered across my table, but I didn't feel like reading them anymore. I had a pretty good idea now what had happened to those hikers who'd followed trails that didn't exist, and I was starting to understand that keeping people safe from those trails was exactly what I'd signed up for, whether I'd known it or not. 3 weeks in, and I'd gotten comfortable with the weirdness. That was my first mistake. I was reading through more incident reports when I heard the familiar scratching on the roof. The giant black dog had been showing up every few nights, always patient, always waiting for cookies. We'd developed this routine. I'd feed her, she'd disappear, and I'd go back to pretending my life made any kind of sense. Except tonight, when I reached for the cookie package on my counter, my fingers found empty space. Shit. I'd forgotten to restock after the last visit. The scratching stopped, followed by that heavy thud as something massive dropped to the ground outside. I looked through the kitchen window, and there she was, sitting in her usual spot. Those blue eyes fixed on the cabin, waiting. "Hey girl," I called through the glass, trying to keep my voice calm. "I'm all out tonight, sorry." The dog tilted her head, then stood and walked closer to the cabin, much closer than usual. She circled the building once, twice, her massive paws silent on the forest floor. On the third pass, she started growling. The sound vibrated through the walls and rattled the windows. This wasn't the patient creature I'd been feeding for weeks. This was something else entirely, something that had run out of patience. She circled faster, the growling getting louder. I backed away from the window as her claws scraped against the cabin's exterior walls. Whatever understanding we'd had was gone, replaced by something that sounded hungry and frustrated and very, very large. I was eyeing the furniture, wondering if I could barricade the door, when headlights swept across the clearing. Maurice's truck pulled up with the high beams blazing, and the growling stopped immediately. Maurice stepped out like this was the most normal thing in the world. He didn't even look concerned, just reached into his truck bed and pulled out a canvas bag. "Shelby," he called. "Come here, girl." The massive dog emerged from the shadows and approached Maurice with her tail wagging, like she was a normal pet happy to see her owner. Maurice fed her something from the bag, bigger treats than my cookies, something that looked homemade. She took them gently, the same way she'd always taken food from me, then nuzzled against his leg before disappearing into the trees. I opened my door as Maurice walked over, still carrying the bag. "You ran out of cookies," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah, I forgot to restock." I was still shaking a little. She got aggressive, really aggressive. Maurice nodded and handed me the bag. "Keep this in your truck. Emergency backup." I looked inside and saw what looked like homemade dog biscuits, except they were huge and smelled like meat and something else I couldn't identify. "Maurice, what the hell is going on? That thing knows you." He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the spot where the dog had vanished. "Her name is Shelby." "You named the monster dog?" "I didn't name her. That was already her name." Maurice sat down heavily on my porch steps. "I lied to you, Eddie, about my former partner." Something cold settled in my stomach. "What do you mean? There was no Kathy Park. I made that up. Been practicing that story for 2 years now, waiting for the next ranger to ask questions." He rubbed his face with both hands. "My real partner was Shelby Thompson. She disappeared on an unmarked trail while investigating the missing persons cases." I sat down next to him, trying to process this. "And the dog, that was her canine partner, also named Shelby, which makes things confusing as hell. The dog came back 3 days after they both went missing, but she came back wrong, changed, still looking for her handler, but not entirely natural anymore." "How long have you been doing this? Feeding her, I mean." "Since she started showing up at the ranger station. She's not dangerous if you follow the protocol, but she gets upset when the routine breaks down." Maurice looked at me. "She's still a dog in some ways. Still loyal, still protective, but she's something else too." I thought about those blue eyes, the intelligence behind them. What happened to the human Shelby? "I don't know. She was investigating the unmarked trails, trying to map where people were disappearing. I told her to stop, told her it was too dangerous, but she thought she could solve it through careful research and preparation." His voice got quiet. "She was wrong." "How long have you been out here, really?" 23 years. Started when I was 31, fresh out of college with big ideas about conservation and public service." Maurice laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Took me about 6 months to realize this job was nothing like what they'd described. And you've been protecting people this whole time." "Trying to. Learning the rules through trial and error, losing partners when I got it wrong. The missing person reports are real, Eddie. People are disappearing into places that shouldn't exist, following trails that aren't on any map. But the Park Service can't acknowledge what's actually taking them without causing mass panic." I stared out at the forest, thinking about Rosie Chang and her perfect smile, the upright deer, the voices on the phone begging for help from impossible places. So what are we really doing here? Keeping people safe from things they can't understand, making sure the wrong people don't wander into the wrong places, protecting secrets that need to stay secret. Maurice stood up. You're not just a ranger, Eddie. You're a guardian, and this forest has guardians of its own. Like Shelby. Like Shelby. She's protecting something too, in her own way. Still trying to complete her last mission, still looking for her partner. The cookies aren't just food, they're a peace offering, a way of saying we're not a threat. I held up the bag of emergency treats, and if I'd run out permanently, then she would have decided you weren't keeping up your end of the bargain. Maurice's expression was grim. The rules aren't suggestions, Eddie. They're survival instructions written in blood and loss and 20 years of learning the hard way. We sat in silence for a while, listening to the normal sounds of the forest. Owls calling, wind in the trees, the distant sound of water running over rocks. Peaceful sounds that I now knew were only part of the story. I could transfer you, Maurice said finally. Put in your file that you're having adjustment issues. Get you moved to a nice safe desk job somewhere. No one would blame you. I thought about my old life in San Francisco, debugging code and sitting in traffic and complaining about coffee that wasn't hot enough. Safe, predictable, boring as hell. Then I thought about the missing hikers, the families who'd never know what really happened to their loved ones, the people who needed protection from dangers they couldn't imagine. No, I said, I'm staying. Maurice smiled, and for the first time since I'd known him, it looked genuinely relieved. Good, because there's a lot more you need to learn. Like what? Like why some trails move when you're not looking. Like what lives in the caves that don't appear on geological surveys. Like how to tell the difference between someone who's lost and someone who's been changed. He stood up and walked toward his truck. And like why we do this job even when it costs us everything. I watched him drive away, then went back inside my cabin. The incident reports were still scattered across my table, but now they looked different. Not just bureaucratic paperwork, but evidence of a war being fought in secret. A war between the normal world and something much older and stranger. I was part of that war now, whether I'd signed up for it or not. And even with the terror, even with the knowledge that I might end up like Shelby Thompson, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt like I mattered,